If I could ask the speakers to come up and take a position here, and then Steve, you're going to act as the MC.
Right. You want to just switch places with me, then I can sit on the end and kind of see the panel.
Sure. Sorry about the debris here.
Could I? Yeah, you gotta push to talk. I thought that was a wonderful set of talks this morning with many different perspectives, and I certainly learned a lot from listening to you all. We have all had our say this morning. I'm sure we've got many questions of one another. I certainly have of all of you, but the audience has been sitting quietly and listening, and I expect they've got some things to say as well. So maybe we'll start. Alan, you want to say something?
I have a question that picks up on our last presentation. And I'd ask the panelists, as they see fit, to comment on this. This is sort of conceptual right now. So you're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and the role that Chinese smart city technology may play in that. What do you think that application might be towards Chinese intentions towards Mexico and farther south? For example, Mexico City is one of the world's largest cities. The Chinese are involved in port development in other cities like Veracruz. So I just asked the panel members to think about that.
Carolyn, it sounds like you're first up with that one.
This is what I need to. Can you hear all right? You know, Latin America is a particularly interesting case because the Chinese have been fairly careful about their presence in the U.S.'s backyard, in our own backyard. I think a little bit more cautious there than in other places in the world, but they are clearly ramping up their interest. And I think that for cities like this Mexico City that are trying to deal with a number of the kinds of challenges that smart cities can address, that smart cities platforms can address, I wouldn't be surprised to see the Chinese government Chinese companies moving in. I use the Chinese government, but Chinese companies moving in. One of the issues that I mentioned that I think is also really important is the fact that these companies have all of these advantages that are provided by the U.S. government, by the Chinese government. You know, they have access to particularly beneficial financing. They have access to sort of the diplomatic initiatives to encourage countries to choose Chinese products that are doing it. So, I mean, I believe at least that China is made quite clear its intentions to have a global presence, and I think that Mexico City is probably a really good place for them to be doing.
Sam, you want to add?
Yeah, we tend to use the phrase hard power and the phrase soft power, which means the ability, in the case of hard power, to exercise military force or coercion, and soft power based is influence based on values and institutions. I think there's an intermediate kind of power, and whether or not you want to call it economic power or technological power, and the Chinese, I think, are very adept at understand. They've become very perceptive in understanding the potential, and this is, you know, hard power is very difficult for them to exercise in the Western Hemisphere and in Latin America. Soft power may be possible, but we have certain proximity advantages. But the technological power, this power of essentially technological adoption, in which you encourage other countries to buy your products, to buy your infrastructure. In fact, you not only encourage them, but provide them with incentives, both from a pricing perspective and a features and service perspective, creates the ability to have influence at distance without the exercise of overt hard power, which can cause friction with the United States, or attempting to gain influence through soft power, which is very indirect and uncertain in its effects. So I think this kind of intermediate exercise of power might be evidenced through the way China is trying to export and deploy smart cities technologies, presumably in this hemisphere.
I got to say, I was struck by the juxtaposition between Carolyn's description of the enthusiasm with which China is developing, promoting, deploying, and Charles's description of the vulnerabilities. If I were a leader in Mexico City and the Chinese came to me and said, we can do A, B, and C for you, and then I heard somebody like Charles, I'd certainly think twice or maybe 3 times. So is that happening, or in fact you see the unalloyed adoption of all this stuff when it's offered?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that, broadly speaking, people acknowledge the immense benefits. I guess we're not. Oh, okay. I think people are noting the immense benefits that we obviously would see from the technology. At least from my experience, both domestically as well as internationally, policymakers are completely overwhelmed with the complexity of the situation. They really don't have a strong analytic framework. Oftentimes their technologists are not able to pair the technology with the organizational functions they support. So there's a lot of really basic work that is needed in governance structures in order for us to get a handle on this. And what I tend to find is when people talk about threats, they talk about it at a very, very high level, but they're not very specific in the way that even when I did it at a high level, I started to be able to pinpoint different ways you can go
It was
after
specific enough.
That's right.
Uwe, you wanted to weigh in?
I just wanted to point out a very foundational issue, and that is that increasingly it is extremely difficult to separate out the deployment of technology from broader investment practices associated with urbanization. And China's not alone. So if you look at Singapore, certainly look at South Korea, the domestic experiences associated with urbanization have been flipped and turned into an export product. And so we shouldn't be surprised that these tectonic shifts in urbanization patterns are at a very core driver for capital formation, for policy solutions, and there is extraordinary value being created. And the point here is that we just can't segregate these issues out.
Tariq, you were, in your former life, involved in a commercial enterprise that was developing and presumably trying to sell smart city technologies. Was the Chinese presence palpable, and did people who might be customers worry about the security aspects of things?
Well, yes, certainly, if you think about large American corporations, and where they are developing their products, where they are planning to market them, the commercial factor is really important there. And I would say that a company like Honeywell has really been at the forefront of setting up R&D centers in places around the world, especially in places like China. I can't really speak for them anymore. It's been 3 years since I was there. But one message resonated, I think, with me, with the way that whole initiative was talked about, and that was that where do we want to be developing our next products, right? And you want to be developing them where you want to sell them, and where are the markets growing the fastest. And the market's growing the fastest in places like China and India and other places. So that's where you should be. If you're going to develop some IoT product or some new thermostat or some air cleaning system or whatever it is, security cameras, and where do you think you'll be able to sell most of them, right? And where you're going to sell most of them, maybe that's where you should be developing them. So I think that mindset is there, and it's a commercial mindset, and it's good for the corporations, and corporations will also argue it's good for the U.S. as well, because these are U.S. companies. But of course, security considerations need to be kept in mind there as well. Let me just add one more thing, since we've been talking about Huawei, and that's come up. So in the last, while I've been at the University of Minnesota, in the last 2 years, I visited Huawei's R&D organization in Shanghai a couple of times, And it's just an incredibly sophisticated and impressive place. Some of you may have been there too. It looks like 3 cruise ships sitting next to each other, something like 7,000 researchers. And this is not their only R&D organization in China by any means. It's not their corporate headquarters, that's in Shenzhen. And when I was there the first time, they had just hired as their corporate vice president for communications a former member of the European Parliament, an Irishman. And he was talking about Huawei's plans and how they were so successful in so many parts of the world, including Mexico, and giving the corporate line, of course. So it's a very sophisticated organization. The amount of investment that's going into, as we've already heard, into R&D in China that's coming from the government and from other sources too. I'm rambling a little bit now, but I'll also mention that having visited a couple of accelerators and incubators in China, and some of these are funded by Silicon Valley as well, and it's again the same mindset there. Silicon Valley investors are looking to sell products in China, and where should they develop those products? How do they get access to the markets in China? It's by doing more things in China, and the Chinese government is also very eager to develop more accelerators, incubators. There's something like 3,000 of them that have been set up in part by government support, and it relates also to made in China. It relates to advanced manufacturing. It relates to the fact that China is no longer a low-cost manufacturing economy. So all of these things do come together in very interesting ways.
I want to turn maybe from the China competition or security angle to what it feels like to live in a city with that kind of surveillance. Hannah, you may know, 15 years ago in this country, the National Security Advisor, John Poindexter, got into big trouble when he started talking about total information awareness, which I won't repeat the definition, but you basically described what that is. How does it feel for the people living in those cities? Are they conscious of it all the time? Do they think, gosh, if I go there, they're going to find out, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think my experience when I was living there and studying abroad there, it's sort of just a part of their life. I mentioned a quote that privacy is sort of just less of a concern there. People are more used to it. They have their app WeChat. You can't send certain messages or certain photos. And as study abroad students, I know different people that played around with it and would try and see what things get flagged. And I know that there's been different official research studies done where different keywords or combinations of words just won't ever be sent on WeChat. But for the citizens living there, I think that's more just a part of their way of life. But obviously that can get taken way out of control as you talked more about the Xinjiang, the situation going on there. So obviously things can spiral out of control when they have a situation like that. And I think that the difference between China and America is that in the United States, people just have, privacy is at a core value for us. And I think that attitude would be very difficult to change for American citizens.
So I think visiting China and looking at how people live their lives there and talking to Chinese friends and other folks there, expatriates as well, one of the senses I get is that, as you're saying, people accept a lot of this and they also see some of the benefits of it as well. So, for example, just a couple of months ago, I was walking back from a jazz club in Shanghai at 1 a.m. and there were deserted streets, but I didn't feel at all unsafe. And I saw some women walking by themselves, which I think you would very rarely see in cities in the U.S. So there's been those sorts of benefits. Another area that China has done really well in is air quality. 10, 15 years ago, if you saw lists of the world's most air-polluted cities, they were dominated by China. You may remember there was talk about air quality in Shanghai and Beijing, and I remember experiencing it myself and thinking, how can people live here? I know people who were expatriates who left China solely because there were 2 people at least they were concerned about bringing up their children in this air quality. last month a list came out of the world's most air polluted cities, the 20 most air polluted cities. I think there was one city in China. Almost all the other cities were all from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. So China, by its somewhat draconian measures in many cases, has actually addressed air quality issues in its urban environment.
So we shouldn't forget that while we're concerned about China as a government, that kind of tracking is certainly possible and probably goes on in the U.S. in the corporate world. You look at the data brokers who are compiling credit cards, mobile phone tracks, et cetera. Basically, one has as little privacy here as one has in China, except it's the state there as opposed to private sector. Carolyn, you have your
Just a comment, though, that I think we have to be really careful drawing conclusions on how people see the world in which they're living when they're living in a surveillance state, because I could point you in the direction of many people who would say how absolutely uncomfortable they are about that, but they have to be very careful who they say that to, right? They're not going to be coming up to somebody on the street or somebody they meet at a cocktail party and expressing concern about their inability to order something or to say something critical of the government, because if you say something critical of the government, you can be found out and you can be imprisoned. So I'm just always very cautious about that. I remember once being in Shanghai and meeting with somebody, an expat who was a representative of a major tech company, and he said at the time, well, I don't see any censorship here. I mean, my kids can order anything they want from Amazon. And honestly, I was dumbfounded because, of course, his kids could order anything that they wanted from Amazon. That didn't mean that people living down the street, not in an expat enclave, could. So I think we need to be careful about that. I do think, though, that you point out this is an issue I have thought a lot about and struggled with, which is in this country, so far, though that's changing now, people have been quite comfortable with the vast amounts of data that private companies are collecting on them. And have allergic reactions when they think that the government could be collecting data, which is the opposite in a lot of places. Again, I do think that's changing as people see what's happening with Facebook and with some of the other companies. But I've always noticed that when we have a discussion about privacy, there are like two different sections of where the concern about privacy is coming from. We don't in this country really, so far, experience the kind of privacy intrusions by our government. That's always possibly can change, but we don't see it so far.
Of course, Europe has been in the forefront as well, the GDPR story, and probably coming here in some form, I would imagine.
But also, when you think about it, I mean, there have been CCTV cameras all over London for decades, right? And most people don't know and never thought about it. So.
That they also have not had the analytical capability to actually do anything with those images except forensic.
Yeah, that's true. Things are very different now.
Now it's different.
I just wanted to, so we've been talking about this in what I would describe a more traditional political government framework. But if we look a little bit broader and think about data and data governance and the either official or legal social contract that accompanies that, or the unstated and implicit social contract that accompanies that. I'd just like to raise this issue that as we think about risk, we also anticipate either very dramatic market disruptions associated with that social contract, or dramatic changes in governance. And so we can, of course, point to other case studies around the world where information has been turned off and people have been controlled through a lack of information. And so the point here, I think, in the broader smart cities conversation is really anticipating very quick changes that may occur, given that the adoption cycles have been measured in just a couple of years so far.
Charles?
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment. You know, a lot of this information is stored in cloud systems and aggregated. There's really a very uneven regulatory landscape that we're facing. So, GDPR obviously is kind of pointed to by privacy advocates is certainly taking a large step in the right direction. Probably less enthusiastic are the tech companies that have to implement it, of course. But when you start thinking about moves like the U.S. Cloud Act, from last year, the state of California's new privacy rules, there's absolutely an uneven playing field about what the roles and responsibilities are of government, certainly in the United States, in protecting that data. And then certainly if there's a breach or a compromise of that data, what their roles and responsibilities are. So I think as we move forward, especially in the West, where we do have this deeper concern about privacy, we also need to be aware that given our federated model of governance, especially in this country, that it's uneven, and we need to understand what types of data are being collected on us, what is actually protected. Because I know, for instance, in the state of Maryland, they recently amended over the last couple of years the definition of personal information. Prior to that, it was very, very basic information. It didn't include things like biometric data. And that has only recently been modified. So I think that's something that we need to be much more aware of as we move forward in this.
One of the things that strikes me, and I understand that, Uri was advocating for more data availability for communities. One of the features that struck me early on in this business is the exponential ease of de-anonymizing as you get more data. And, the famous example of the unmasking of Dukakis's medical records back 20 years ago, you don't need very many pieces of data to de-anonymize. And so I think we have to think very carefully about what we make public and what we don't, and the ability to correlate and hence identify.
I think actually the point of the technology is moving faster than we can even understand the consequences of the technology. But just to reiterate a point that I made, who is leading the global entities that are trying to deal with these governance questions is really important, which is why I pointed out the ITU. If you have somebody from an authoritarian country being the person who is trying to set standards or setting standards globally, you're going to end up with a different set of standards than you might agree with on the Western.
Sam?
We are using the word governance, but I want to re-inject the word government into that discussion. We tend to think of governing what happens on the ground as opposed to governing what happens in cyberspace. But we're going to find that these new IT ecosystems on which smart cities depend erase the distinction between physical space and cyberspace as it relates to what we govern. We don't have a model for governing cyberspace. China does. China's concept of cybersecurity is not about your privacy. It is about safeguarding, and they're quite explicit about this, and it's for them it's quite legitimate. Shanghai Accord 2009. It's about controlling and limiting threats to the sovereign prerogatives of government. That's what cyberspace is about, and cybersecurity is about, and cyberspace is about governing human behavior in cyberspace, just as you try to govern human behavior on the streets of a city. As we build new cyber ecosystems in smart cities, one question is, who governs that? And at the moment, my concern is that governance will be less something that is undertaken by a government authority recognized in the United States or recognized in a liberal democracy, and more whatever company is contracted to mediate that information and the use of resources based on the mediation of that information. And I don't know who that's going to be. But I would say if you take a look at Guangzhou, and Hannah will know this better than I will, it seems to me that to a certain extent the government of that city is in part the responsibility of Alibaba. Now, Alibaba may be indistinguishable from a government organization. But if we do the same thing in the United States, say we do it in Cincinnati, the government of Cincinnati, as it relates to the unification of cyberspace and physical space, will in part be done by whatever company builds and or operates that system. I think we need to understand the implications of this, because I don't think most government organizations, most city councils, town councils, county councils, city managers, and mayors have the slightest idea about how to govern such a city. But they're going to have to learn how to do it, because that's coming.
Hannah, do you want to comment on this issue of governance versus governing and the private sector versus the government?
I think that in the City Brain project in Hangzhou, there's definitely like that connects back to who's responsible for the data, and that's important to consider. Is it Alibaba who's responsible for what's going on, or is it the city government? And I don't know the answer to that either, but I think that's something that's at the definitely top concern if we were to do something like this in the United States, is who's responsible, what happens if something goes wrong, and are the citizens, are they given any sort of insurance or assurance that their data is being protected, and that if something does go wrong, they're not going to be just essentially left out to dry with their data.
What's their redress? In this country, you have the right of redress, but perhaps not in that environment.
You know, cities have, many, not all, cities have long relied on private sector to provide critical infrastructure, the power company, the water company, natural gas, and so on. At one level, this is not qualitatively different, but it is different in degree, perhaps. Charles?
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment to that. So the U.S. Cloud Act starts to maybe not address, but certainly covers this issue where, let's say you have data from, let's say it's a German citizen that's being housed in an Amazon data center in New Jersey. The provision in the act basically allow the German government to negotiate with Amazon about acquisition of data. And so it's actually out of the hands of the individual person, and now it's in the hands of corporate governance. Now, let's hope that Amazon pushes back, but oftentimes that's done in secret. And so these complex structures that have been highlighted are very problematic. And I agree. I think the technology is evolving very much quicker than our human governance systems, no doubt.
I can't resist to ask a tangential question. I often ask the cloud providers, all the names that have come to mind, is it really secure? And I'm assured, 100%, or at least it's more secure than anything you could do yourself. You want to comment, or maybe Sam or Charles or both, on cloud security?
Actually, yeah, cloud. A lot of progress has been made in the cybersecurity of cloud systems. I've never seen a perfect cybersecurity regime, but I will say that a few years ago, people were reluctant to put corporate data in the cloud or sensitive data in the cloud. But today, there really aren't all that many alternatives. The per-seat cost of cloud, the advantages of being able to manage workload in the cloud, the ubiquity of the cloud, all of these factors have caused essentially cloud-based infrastructures to become preferred. And cloud-based analytics, things like Predix, I think we were talking about Predix earlier, companies like C3, the idea of being able to aggregate lots of data and then use that data to identify patterns and then define courses of actions, and doing it in the cloud, that makes it very efficient. So this has required, this has been an impetus, I think, for cloud providers to do a better job. And companies like Amazon, I think, were among the first to require two-factor authentication for anybody touching one of their servers, no matter where it is. U.S. government has made progress in things like FedRAMP to ensure that better cybersecurity standards are applied to any cloud that's going to be serving federal government purposes. So while I wouldn't say that it is perfect, I do actually think that while one might do a better job as an individual enterprise, I'm not sure that many individual enterprises do. So I'd say the impetus towards better cloud security has been strong, and there's been good progress.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, it kind of depends. In some cases, yes, cloud providers provide a larger degree of security. So, for instance, physical security, these data centers, are pretty locked down. In terms of the baseline security they provide to operating systems, they automatically patch, and they do that on a regular schedule. So inherent vulnerabilities that are discovered in the underlying operating systems, oftentimes, yeah, you don't have to worry about that. But that says nothing about the applications that sit on those devices. Amazon is not guaranteeing that whatever software you deploy is free from vulnerability, right? So that's why we get some of these large compromises of data, because the user forgot to actually lock it down. So I think it kind of depends. Yep.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience. Yes?
So with regards to, say, centers of gravity and taking out the idea that vendors have a lot of power, smart city, okay, it seems like the mayor will have the power. And you have multiple cities, they're connected, okay, now it's a smart county, it grows up to be the smart state. So the governor has the power. Is that where we foresee the power laying? Or in the United States, is it a likelihood of the U.S. federal government pushing down a standardization with regards to smart governments? Or is kind of expecting each state being its own microcosm, how they normally are? And so each state, each state has their own different standards. So California has an A+ rating in aggregate, but Nevada is a C+, but they're interconnected, so that creates vulnerabilities. Where do we see like the future power? Where is it currently, and where do we foresee it?
You want to take a crack at that one?
So I'd like to just make two comments on that. One is, if you're not comfortable with linear evolution of markets, then you're going to be very, very uncomfortable with our new reality here, because the innovation is so distributed that it's going to be very hard, I think, to come up with a single paradigm as you're suggesting. The second I'd just say is, there is tremendous pressure on cities, but often this takes the form of mayors, as you correctly point out, to act, and whether that's out of primarily concern of local economic development, of jobs, of creating greater efficiencies in their administrative frameworks. And I think an excellent example of this, close to home, is Mayor Peduto in Pittsburgh, who, on the basis of a handshake, no contracts, no pieces of paper, on a basis of a handshake, welcomed Uber into Pittsburgh, and an extraordinary amount of collaborative research with Carnegie Mellon University to really position their city on the global stage with respect to autonomous vehicles. So it's just one example, but I think there are so many examples like that happening at all levels of government, I believe, and happening in so many different markets and geographies.
One of the problems is fragmentation of city governments. There are, I don't know how many tens of boroughs in London. Southern California Association of Government has got 50-something different communities that are all really one unified entity. And so getting that kind of coherence, as you might have in New York or Chicago, is difficult in many other localities. Carolyn?
Yeah, I also think that we might have to draw distinctions to confuse things even more, sort of between power and control and access. So you have somebody who has to make the decision about what's going to be installed and what is it? Is it going to do water? Is it going to do transportation? How do you do that? Then it isn't necessarily the same thing that the person who makes that decision is the person who's going to have control over the functioning of the platform once you have it out there. And then you have the whole problem of access to the data so there will be sort of licit and illicit, potentially licit and illicit access to the data. So I think as we think about this model, it's going to be complicated in sort of ensuring standards and responsibility. And one of my concerns always is, of course, that we always find out about these things after it's too late, right? So how is it that, I mean, what have we just learned? That it turns out that Amazon has thousands of young people listening to what people say on Alexa for certain reasons. But I mean, we find out about these things. We find out about the hacks because it's been hacked. We don't, so I think also the issue of responsibility, who is ultimately responsible when the system breaks down, is going to be an important thing too.
Cross-cutting theme has been
Wait for the microphone, please. There's one up there.
So one of the cross-cutting themes has been that city governments may not have the expertise to handle these questions. What are the real skills gaps that are there, and how can we start to get them into government quickly?
Let me start just my experience with the New York City government, and then maybe I'll ask Tariq to comment as well. Bloomberg started probably in his second term an analytic fervor in New York City and created a Office of Data Analytics, Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, which was basically a skunk works headed by a guy named Mike Flowers, who's a wonderful person to talk to about these things. And they went around and just went agency to agency doing interesting things with the data. When Bloomberg ceased being mayor and de Blasio came in, we at CUSP, who were working closely with the city, were very worried that that kind of push from the top would disappear. But in fact, we found out to our surprise and delight that it had filtered down into the individual departments. And you now have data scientists in fire, police, sanitation, housing, and so on. But the skills are difficult to come by. Not only do you need to be a data scientist, let's say a fresh out bachelor's or master's in data science, but you really need domain knowledge also. And in fact, that's where the biggest problem is. So the challenge is marrying up those two in an effective team. Tariq?
Well, I was going to make a point, and that is, we talk a lot about the skills gap in the United States and elsewhere from a technology perspective, particularly in cybersecurity, the field in which I've been working. But I would say if we want to address the problem that you raised, we need to address that problem in two other disciplines. One is in the discipline of political science. The other is in the discipline of public administration. At Georgetown, where I teach, as an adjunct, we have a program called Science and Technology and International Affairs. I think we need to have curricula called Science and Technology in Public Administration, and Science and Technology is in political science, to start to teach people who are interested in politics and in governing and public administration what are the implications of these technologies and how these technologies can be employed usefully. And my guess is, without knowing more, that this is that there's probably a huge gap here, particularly among people who are not raised with the use of these technologies, who find them either quaint or novel or threatening, but don't necessarily find them as something that they can employ as productively as they might. So I think one thing I would do, and I would urge that we do, is that we should embed essentially this kind of understanding in the curricula of political science and in the curricula of public administration in the United States, and do it soon, rather than wait for the smart cities-based train wreck, which I think we can avoid. We can take advantage of this if we get it right, or we can make a mess of it if we ignore it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was gonna follow right on that. I couldn't agree more with Sam's comments. And in fact, at the University of Maryland, I'm embedded in the School of Public Policy, and we actually started up a new course in cyber policy. And I teach that course, and it's actually, the first half of it is all about technology. It's understanding how the internet works. And then we switch over to policy, and the argument is that if you don't understand how things work, how can you possibly understand, the policy elements to it? And the big concern at the time from the dean and others, that no one was going to sign up for it. They felt that none of the students were going to sign up, and they said, well, if you get 3, then we'll let you actually teach it. Well, we were oversubscribed, so we had it allotted for 20. We had 15 people on the wait list, and so this year when we offered it again, we bumped it up to 50, and it's fully subscribed. And the School of Information Studies is now cross-listing it. And what we're finding across the campus is that folks in business, public policy, political science, journalism, they're all deeply interested in this subject for these social reasons. So I just I just could not agree more with Sam's comment.
Yeah, it's the other one, yeah. So we've heard about some enlightened, forward-thinking mayors, like in New York and Pittsburgh, and in Minneapolis we had one too, still probably do, but the previous one, Mayor R.T. Ryback, he was really looking at being very data-centric, and in fact wrote a memoir called Pothole Confidential, part of which was about he set up this infrastructure so that potholes could get quickly identified and repaired. But that's that's not a sustainable way to create smart infrastructures and create smart cities around the country or around the world. So there is, I think, a bit of a challenge about how do we make sure that the right solutions are being adopted, progress is being made, technologies are being taken forward at the right point in time for the right reasons, because things can go both ways. There are cases where people will not, or cities will not be investing in technologies which could do really good for the citizens because they don't know about them. On the other hand, there's also the possibility, and we've seen that too, where companies will come and sell a technology which is not quite ready for prime time. And I feel like it's people like us who should have more of a role there, and it's part of our responsibility to send the right messages and interact with the right people at the right levels, not just amongst ourselves in technical communities.
Carolyn?
Yeah, I'm actually very encouraged to hear that there are programs in universities to promote considering these in the context also of public service. Because as I think about all of these things, I also think about cost. How is it that just say a small community, which also can benefit from all of these technologies, can afford the talent, when the talent can make 2, 3, 4 times as much working for a major company, for example. So that's going to be one of the challenges. I think another challenge is going to be sort of maintaining the analytical capability over time. And I know that there are some accounting companies in this country that have outsourced their data analytics to other countries, right? So that the costs are significantly lower, but then it raises a whole other series of concerns about privacy, who has access, what they're doing with that information. But I think anytime we're talking about something that is municipal, state, local, we need to be sensitive to the fact that some people don't know, but there are people who do know, but simply don't have a system that can afford to provide the talent and what they need.
The skills gap is not unique to government, although perhaps exacerbated because of the traditionally lower compensation. There are so many large non-tech companies who are sitting on masses of data about their suppliers, their operations, their customers, and are trying to figure out what to do with it. And anybody with the word data in their degree title is a very hot commodity these days.
This is a great conversation. I just want to broaden it even more here and build on a couple of the previous comments. I think we have to understand that this broader process of urbanization, especially in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, is happening at a pace that is so totally unprecedented that not only is this the approach that we've just taken in this conversation, an issue of education and knowledge within a specific industry, but certainly if you look globally at the companies that are integrating various fields together into a set of services delivered to cities that include not just technologies, whether they be traditional or kind of new technologies, but also administrative and finance services packaged in with them. I certainly do see a migration of intellectual capital moving squarely into the private sector. And this raises many really, I think, challenging but also very interesting questions around how these investments will be made. Obviously, how they'll be made responsibly, but on what basis and to what degree will they actually be sustainable? And I just don't think you can have that conversation from a traditional public policy perspective.
Yeah, one other initiative that that we're starting to undertake at the University of Maryland is specifically this problem of training students in the policy in the policy school to understand at a high level these myriad of analytic methods, because oftentimes my students, for instance, they've heard of AI, they've heard of machine learning, they have no concept of what it is. So actually breaking that down, we're not training them to be data scientists, but what we're trying to do is train them to be better consumers, so that, because I've seen this, in my own professional career, where you see folks come in and they're selling a black box that says, hey, it'll solve all your problems, and honestly, there's just not enough knowledge about it to ask the right questions. And so that's something I just wanted to highlight. I really do see it as a challenge for the 21st century in training next generation policy students.
Yeah. Good. There's a question.
Yes. This has been a really interesting discussion. It's brought a lot of things to mind for me. First of all, I just wondered if anybody has started mapping out any smart city alliances between, say, sister cities, any agreements that have been forged, things like that. Might be a sensible thing to do, and I'm thinking of the Chinese. You've got long-term strategic thinkers there, and I'm wondering if there's been any attempt by the Chinese, for example, to try to extend the Silk Road, up, say, the Mississippi River in the U.S. That would be pretty bold, right, if they decided to try to do something like that. However, there is something like a new Belt and Road Center partnership at Washington University in St. Louis, and there was also some interesting stuff going on back in 2012 in America's Central Port, where there's some agreements forged between the U.S. and China with respect to port activities. But I don't know if those just fell apart due to simple economics or if there was something more involved there. So what I'm thinking is, in the future, are we going to need to start thinking about transnational smart cities, things like that, virtual smart cities? I live in Delaware, and our water company is a company based in France, which has subsidiaries all over the world. So if something happens in France, what's going to happen? Are those linkages going to be explored by somebody? I think it's an interesting thing to think about.
Anybody want to take that on? Carol?
Yeah, I think, you talk about, is there a digital Silk Road going up the Mississippi, for example? I think that the Chinese government would be prudent enough not to talk about it in the context of like a digital Silk Road or anything like that. There very well may be communities around the country that are using Chinese equipment. It's one of the reasons that the Huawei concerns all came up. It's about ZTE, it's about China Telecom. But to the best of my knowledge, there isn't necessarily a known plan for what it is that they're trying to do there. So, I mean, again, you get to the point of cost. I mean, when a Chinese company can provide this equipment and potentially the services at 30% below what the other lowest bidder is, what is somebody who is constrained by, we have to go with low-cost bidders supposed to be doing? So.
Okay, Terry?
I think that's an interesting question. I actually had thought of that too earlier in some previous talk. Are there cities collaborating with each other? And I have two things to say there, neither of which really directly answers the question or answers it affirmatively anyway. And so IEEE has certainly been trying to establish connections with cities individually and getting those cities to coordinate with each other as well. But it hasn't really led to a lot of success as yet, usually for reasons of ownership and funding and all of that. But they do have these, and I showed a list of identified affiliate and core cities which are around the world, and then events where they can meet and collaborate, or conference calls or something where they'll do that. The other thought I had in this context was, and this is not so much in the sense of city-to-city collaboration, but in the sense that the challenges we are trying to deal with are certainly not limited to one country, and they're global challenges faced by cities around the world. And we've talked about China, but in the context of sort of collaborations that we should be encouraging more, I think having more collaboration between the European Union and the US in smart city technologies would be a really good thing. And I think that a lot of the same values are shared. Of course, there are differences like GDPR. I've been involved actually in the just finished one European Commission Horizon 2020 project as the US lead for that. That was about smart cities and IoT and big data and 5G, and just started another one on smart cities in the context of next generation internet. And the challenge with doing things like this is that it's very hard to get incentives and get funding to allow collaborations, meaningful collaborations, to happen across the pond. So funding agencies like the European Commission will not fund researchers or other people for that matter in the US, and conversely as well. So I think we could see more collaboration happening between cities, US, EU, with some more funding available.
About,
Can I
sorry,
ask
go
a
ahead, Sam.
question of Hannah in that regard? Hannah, as you were going through the list of technologies in Alibaba and in CityBrain, I thought I heard the mention of a number of US companies whose technologies they're using. Was I correct in that? Companies like Predix, that Alibaba is integrating technology sourced not only in China but overseas, including the US?
Yeah, Predix and Informatica. I can get the full list, but yeah, there's a lot of different technologies that they're integrating to use to create these different platforms.
Okay, thank you.
So with regard to collaboration between various cities, about 5 years ago, a 501c3 called Metro Labs Network was stood up out of Carnegie Mellon. The last I looked, I haven't looked at it recently, it's a group of about 40 cities and the universities within them that are demonstrating, developing smart city and deploying smart city technologies. CUSP was one of the larger, but Chicago is a big player also with the Center for Urban Computation and Data, Urban CCD. Carnegie Mellon was a big player and so on. So if you want to see they run an annual meeting and there's newsletter and workshops and so on. So that's some method for diffusing technologies among various cities. Carolyn?
Well, and another possible way to do it, and I presume that they're doing this, but I don't know this, is through something like the National Governors Association, the League of Cities, the National Association of Counties. There are people who can share. I presume they all have task forces on this.
Absolutely,
I don't know.
of course.
Yeah, so people are trying to patch it together, I think, in different ways. I think that the challenge about getting financing for some of these things is again a really big one.
So, and we have some great case studies as well as the federal government participating in fact, convening and leading great innovation ecosystems, primarily out of NIST, and the U.S. Department of Transportation, of course, very famously had competitive procurement for autonomy. But I would like to kind of connect that question back to Carolyn's talk, and that is clearly we do not have the levels of funding in this country to support a vigorous innovation ecosystem in this space. When you compare it to what's happening in China and other countries. And again, I just want to underscore, and sorry for hitting the same point repeatedly here, that this conversation represents the economic future of so many domestic policy platforms across the world, but we haven't articulated it that way in the United States.
There's a question at the microphone.
Yeah, I was just speculating on the cost problem. It seems like there are plenty of cities that might want to buy something, but they can't even afford 30% discount. So, I read every day about some cities got a 1960s software system and they just won't do anything with it. It's junk and that's it. So I was just wondering whether it's not the major cities that will transform. Is it possible that the edge cities, Tyson's Corner is the new future? And is that where, we'll have the innovation and the new people will migrate there into now smaller, but places where they have the tax base and can grow?
So at least within the Metro Labs network, cities like San Jose, California, or South Bend, Indiana, were among the more forward-looking small cities that might have surprised you a priori. Sam?
One thing that my team is doing at MITRE on behalf of our NIST sponsor is trying to bend the cost curve in terms of the application of commercial technology to cybersecurity and now to secure Internet of Things, transportation, energy, healthcare, and other essentially smart cities-like technologies. This is hard. We find that smaller organizations, smaller companies, mid-sized companies still can't afford many of the most advanced technologies, at least in the cybersecurity area. So we've been working, we've done some 200 cooperative research and development agreements with over 100 companies to gain access to their technology and work with them to apply them in more cost-effective ways. But going back to the point that Uwe made, we need, I think, to scale this up significantly, maybe by an order of magnitude in scope and resources, to be able to ensure that we don't create a digital divide in which wealthier communities get the advantage of secure smart cities technologies, whereas lesser affluent communities find that there's no way they can get access to them. And that, I think, is a responsibility that we have to address. And if we don't, inevitably, it will deepen the digital divide in the United States rather than ameliorate it.
I had just written on a note, a digital divide, that's something that I think we all need to be really aware of and working to address. But look, we're never going to be able to match the Chinese in terms of the amount of money that they are putting into these things. But we have been on a trajectory where we are not investing enough in basic research. We are not investing enough in innovation. And I'll take it beyond investment. I mean, we need to take steps in this country to make sure that we're doing everything we can to attract and retain talent. And it's going in the opposite direction right now. So there are things that the U.S. government can and should be doing. That doesn't mean that we're doing them.
The last one you mentioned is probably the biggest problem, and we don't discuss it enough. Other questions from the audience? We've got about 5 minutes left. I'll just go down the row and pose one. Well, you can say whatever you want as a closing remarks, but let me try. Going in the other direction of the upsides of all of this, smartest city, greatest hits, what are the things that you can point to as achievements of making cities more intelligent that you would use to promote this notion? And Tariq, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, so I'm not quite sure I got the question, but I'll just answer what I want to answer.
Okay.
Yeah. So the area of energy, which we haven't really talked about too much, but of course it's a really important concern. And I think it was mentioned, sort of this, maybe you mentioned the connection between matching supply and demand in energy, and of course as we go towards renewable sources, and that becomes more and more important as we try and have more electric vehicles to reduce pollution. We need more power for those as well. And I don't know if there's sort of real success stories as yet to point to, but there have been significant trials of technologies like automated demand response, including in China, that have been quite successful. So sort of integrating, engaging private companies. It's been mostly in the commercial and industrial space, but some residential as well. So end users, the governments as well, in some cases funding agencies, to develop infrastructures where energy usage can be automatically adjusted based on, in some cases, when the sun's shining and when it's not, right? And I think that's a really good sort of approach to continue this path forward. Now, one challenge that's happened in promoting this whole area of smarter energy and smart grid is that energy prices have fallen so much since the whole interest started. But so that's the challenge. But I think it's still a real opportunity.
Thereby increasing demand, but that's a different discussion. Okay, good, Sam.
I want to maybe build on what Tariq said, because I think he's got it absolutely right. I mean, if you take a look at infrastructure, transportation, and energy in particular, it's clunky. It really is. We have essentially centralized power generation and then huge losses in its transmission and consumption, transportation resources that big things which lie idle most of the time, and then we mobilize them with a ton of gasoline to move one person around on a journey through unconstrained traffic. Makes no sense. The data is available. We might as well learn how to use it. And so creating an environment in which people stop thinking about, I want to own a car, but when I need transportation, I get it. When I need energy, I get it. Essentially moving to a more seamless on-demand experience in which things are used on demand and the use of those resources is mediated intelligently, I think is a huge upside. There are privacy issues, there are security issues, there are governance and government issues, I get it. But there's a reason for doing it. There are reasons why smart cities exist, because it's not just a way of controlling people, it's not just an Orwellian exercise, it really is to be able to convey advantages to the human experience. If we can get around some of our fears and deal with some of those problems, then that more seamless on-demand human experience that I think Tariq tried to describe so well, I think that can be put in our hands. So I think that's an upside.
Hannah.
I agree. I think that in terms of promoting smart cities, it's about how how their lives can be easier, and going off of balancing supply and demand. So demand for public transportation and things like that, and balancing the supply of what they have and be able to optimize it to just create a more efficient city. And it really does make citizens' lives easier. Just looking at the City Brain project in China, they're able to have so much more efficiency in their infrastructure, and in terms of public safety and emergency vehicles, their city is safer, people are getting ambulances to them more quickly, and so I think it really just creates a lot of advantages.
Good. Uri?
I agree, and there are so many examples of increased efficiencies. There's so many examples of that. I also want to actually bring forward a very positive case study in China, and that is the local impact of the financial technologies, the person-to-person payments that have allowed for highly localized economies to emerge within cities that would have been unimaginable without that technology.
Good. Karen?
Yeah, I think that the efficiencies that everybody is talking about are really important. It's interesting, though, that does it then become things that people just don't see that government does for them? I mean, this happens a lot, that people say, well, I don't want to pay my taxes because what does it do for me? Well, of course, there are street lights, there are police, there are all sorts of things. So I think we need to be cognizant of making sure that people understand that this is an investment in efficiency that's taking place. And I think that a lot of those things can be worked out. I mean, the idea of being able, frankly, to get in a car and not get stuck in DC traffic is a very, very attractive idea.
I'll pay for
that. It takes me an hour to drive 5 miles. I think that there's something very attractive about that. But
Sure.
so there's the upside. I just think that we need to make sure that we consider the whole panoply of issues that come up, and not just be blinded by the upside about this, but to think about the challenges.
Charles?
So I'm originally from Southern California, and so I'm extremely concerned about water usage, especially as we talk about climate change moving forward, and we talk about certain parts of certainly the U.S. and other parts of the world suffering from water shortage. So I look at the benefits of using water efficiently, and I can tell you, being from Southern California, we think we live on the East Coast sometimes, where we're watering these lawns that really should not be there. So I think using sensor data much more efficiently to identify water wastage is going to be not only of the public interest, but it's going to be critical for just human societies.
Good. Carolyn,
Can I
you
just,
really get the last
one more caveat, because it is smart cities and communities, and we have talked a lot about the urban experience. I think it's very important that we don't leave other communities out. When you see how there are smaller, some more disadvantaged communities in this country that are reviving because young people with all of these technical skills that we have had to learn, but that they grew up with, are able to telecommute, essentially. I mean, you can work from anywhere if you have access to it. So the 5G access is going to promote the ability of communities around this country to be able to do economic development and potentially revive themselves. And I
Good.
think that's a positive.
Good. So we are 2 minutes over the appointed time. I want to thank my fellow speakers for a wonderful set of presentations and great discussion, and to thank the three gentlemen in the front here for catalyzing this and making it possible. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you.